She was told to move, without a glance at her ticket. The flight attendant blocked her seat, insisting she didn't belong in first class. Others were welcomed without question. But the woman she dismissed? She was the wife of one of the airline's most powerful stakeholders, who happened to be sitting right behind her. So who really didn't see what mattered? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more real, thought-provoking stories like this one to light. Thank you. The flight hadn't taken off yet, but everything in first class already moved in perfect rhythm. A chilled glass of champagne, a folded blanket, polite nods exchanged between people who believed they all belonged there. Amara Harris entered quietly, dressed in a soft cream suit. Her steps were unhurried, her eyes calm. She carried a worn leather handbag and the kind of grace that didn't need attention. To most, she looked like someone who'd gotten lucky with an upgrade. No diamond necklace, no entourage, just a woman with quiet dignity and a seat marked 2A. The cabin crew barely looked up, except one. Denise Carson, the flight's senior attendant, spotted her and moved in with swift certainty. No questions, no smiles, just a single sentence that would change the course of that flight. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong section." But what Denise didn't know was who was watching from just one row behind. The hum of the cabin was steady, polite, and controlled, just as it always was in first class. Everything smelled of quiet luxury, leather seats, citrus-infused towels, and a hint of expensive perfume lingering in the air. Atlantic Skies Flight 7A was boarding its final few passengers for the long journey from JFK to San Francisco, and the crew moved with a rehearsed rhythm. Amara Harris stepped into the cabin, her pace unhurried, her expression soft but composed. She was dressed in a light cream suit, neatly pressed. Her shoes were low-heeled, polished but modest, and the leather handbag over her shoulder bore the gentle wear of someone who had used it for years, not because she couldn't afford another, but because some things carried meaning. She paused briefly to glance at her boarding pass, then looked up, eyes scanning for seat 2A. A few passengers looked up from their newspapers and iPads, then quickly back down. Her presence didn't disrupt them, it merely confused them for a moment. Not by noise, not by movement, just by contrast. She reached her seat and began to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. Her motion was careful, almost reverent, as if she didn't want to disturb the space around her. That's when she heard it, flat, direct, and without a trace of welcome. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong section. This is first class." The voice belonged to Denise Carson, mid-40s, trim figure, her uniform perfectly tucked, scarf tied with airline-issue precision. She had the air of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by anything, or anyone, anymore. Amara blinked once, calmly. She reached into her jacket and retrieved the boarding pass. "It's 2A, she said, extending the slip of paper. Denise didn't look at it, not even a glance. Instead, she reached forward and nudged Amara's hand away from the armrest. Not harshly, not violently, but with enough firmness to make the message unmistakable. "You'll need to move," she said again. Her tone dipped in condescension this time. "Let's not make a scene." The cabin, once humming, now felt too quiet. A man in a navy blazer looked up, then looked away. A woman in pearls lowered her tablet just enough to glance, then slowly lifted it again like pulling down a curtain. Amara's hand, still holding the boarding pass, slowly lowered to her side. She said nothing. Her lips remained pressed together, not out of submission, but out of understanding. She had seen this before. She knew the rules of these moments. Don't react. Don't rise. Don't give them anything to use against you. She took a small step back. And that was when her eyes caught the man in seat 3A. He had just lowered his book, hardcover, no dust jacket, and placed it gently in his lap. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes weren't. They were watching everything, every shift of Denise's shoulder, every flick of the wrist, every glance avoided by the passengers around them. Amara didn't nod to him. She didn't need to. There was an understanding in that one moment, quiet, invisible, but unbreakable. Denise turned on her heel and walked briskly back toward the galley, muttering something under her breath about upgrades gone wrong. The moment passed. The silence, somehow, did not. Amara stood for another few seconds, her bag still overhead, her boarding pass still in hand. Then, as if nothing had happened, she sat down in seat 2A. No one said a word. The cabin returned to its usual rhythm, air vents whirring, attendants moving, glasses clinking. But on the tray beside Amara's seat, a cup of tea, brought out early per her request, sat untouched. The steam slowly faded, curling into the air, disappearing like it had never been there. She rested her hand on the armrest again, fingers steady. Behind her, the man in 3A opened his book once more. But he wasn't reading, he was waiting, and he wasn't the only one. The aircraft had begun to fill with that quiet hum of readiness. Amara finally sat down in 2A after a younger flight attendant politely checked her boarding pass, gave a brief nod, and stepped away without fuss. But even in that moment of resolution, Denise passed by again, her glance cool, almost casual, as if to say, "You may have won a seat, but you haven't earned your place." Amara didn't look back. She gently settled into the leather seat, her posture dignified, hands folded over her lap. Through the window, she watched the ground crew outside move like clockwork under the fading afternoon light. But inside her chest, the air felt tight, still, like waiting out a storm you're certain will come again. She exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something that had followed her in. And just like that, her mind wandered home. The kitchen in New Jersey was always too quiet after lunch. Tiled floor, old oak cabinets, a clock that ticked like it had been there since before the house had walls. That's where she often sat, alone, reading recipes she never cooked, staring out the window that looked into the neighbor's yard. Before Malik, her life had been filled with classrooms, high school kids with tired eyes, parents who sent her thank you notes, a modest office in a community center where she organized food drives and book donations. She had been needed, known, not famous, but familiar. Then came Malik, the whirlwind of it, the headlines, the parties where people smiled too hard, and the silence that followed her into every luxury space, every gala, every boardroom, every private jet, where people stared a second too long, or not at all. She remembered one dinner, vividly, a resort restaurant in Palm Springs. She had arrived first. The host, in a suit too tight at the shoulders, had asked, "Are you with the staff dinner?" She had simply smiled, not out of politeness, but restraint. When Malik arrived 10 minutes later and kissed her on the cheek, the man's face had drained of color, but he never apologized. Back in her seat now, Amara reached into her handbag, pulled out a soft leather journal, and placed it gently on her lap. She flipped to the marked page, where her handwriting curved neatly, patient and small. One day, build a travel foundation for young black women to see the world safely. That line had been there for over a year. She had written it one morning over coffee, after reading about a young woman who had been removed from a flight for looking suspicious. That morning, Amara hadn't cried, but she hadn't forgotten. She didn't know if she'd ever start that foundation, but she kept writing it, over and over, like a quiet vow made to no one but herself. From somewhere behind her, she heard footsteps approach, measured, familiar. Denise walked past again, the scent of sharp perfume trailing just behind. Her gaze passed over Amara as if she were another seat number, another inconvenience to manage. It wasn't hate in her eyes, just dismissal. That particular brand of disregard Amara had come to know all too well. It didn't scream, it dismissed in silence. Amara closed the journal softly and returned it to her bag. She adjusted her seatbelt, then reached for the small cup of tea on the side tray. It had gone lukewarm. She lifted it anyway, sipping slowly. As the plane rolled toward the runway, she let the quiet fill her chest again, not as a burden this time, but as a shield. Just one row behind, Malik glanced at his phone, the screen briefly lighting his face. The message was simple. Camera onboard synced, audio captured. Want to review now or later? He didn't respond right away. He looked ahead at the back of Amara's seat, and then beyond it, out the same window she had stared through moments ago. The question now wasn't whether to review the footage. It was when to act, and whether the world was ready for what came next. The quiet in first class had a certain weight to it. Not oppressive, not hostile, just heavy. Like the kind of silence that follows a question left unanswered. The plane had begun its taxi. The hum of the engines low and steady. Passengers adjusted their reading lights, unfolded napkins, and reopened books. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place. But behind seat 2A, something had shifted. Malik Harris sat with his tablet resting on one knee, its screen still dim. He hadn't turned a page of his book in 10 minutes. His fingers remained on the corner of the hardcover, but his attention hadn't touched the print. Instead, his gaze held steady on the back of the seat ahead, on Amara. He had watched Denise Carson's every move, not just the way she dismissed Amara, but the ease of it, the casual authority in her hand as she nudged his wife aside, the slight purse of her lips as she turned away. Not a flicker of doubt, no hesitation, just routine. That was what settled in Malik's chest more than anything else. Routine. He unlocked his phone. Thumb moved across the screen with muscle memory. Within seconds, he had opened a proprietary interface few people even knew existed. Atlantic Skies, like many premium carriers, had implemented silent monitoring tools to flag and trace service issues, especially for high-tier clients. Malik didn't need to ask permission. He didn't need to escalate through channels. He was one of the few who could trigger action at the top, without raising his voice. Without standing up, he pulled up the internal cabin feed. Time-stamped, synced, clean angle. He watched, in high resolution, the exact moment Denise had pressed her palm against Amara's armrest and said, "Let's not make a scene." No audio, but the body language said enough. He clipped the footage, attached it, and typed 4 words. "Identify this flight attendant. Initiate flag." Within 15 seconds, a response appeared. Name: Denise Carson. Position: Senior FA. Atlantic Skies. Tenure: 12 years. Customer complaints: 2. Verbal disrespect. Unresolved. Internal rating: borderline, pending review. Malik let the phone rest on his lap. He didn't look up. Not yet. Up in 2D, Charles Myers adjusted his glasses and stared, stunned, at the back of Amara's head. He hadn't realized it at first. She looked different out of context. No podium, no crowd, but now he remembered. That charity dinner in Brooklyn. The woman who had spoken quietly, powerfully, about literacy programs for underserved teens. The one who, when asked why she preferred to fund local initiatives rather than global ones, had said simply, "Because we forget our neighbors." Charles looked around. Nobody had intervened when she was pushed aside. Nobody had spoken, and maybe he wouldn't have either. Years ago, but something in his gut stirred now. He opened Twitter on his phone. His fingers hesitated, then typed. "Just watched a black woman in first class get shoved aside like she didn't belong. This is not okay. Hashtag Flight 7A. He hit send before he could second guess it. The tweet didn't explode immediately, but within 5 minutes, it had been shared by 2 accounts with large followings. Within 10, a former journalist picked it up. Denise continued her rounds. She didn't notice the quiet shift in posture among a few passengers. She didn't notice the small cluster of glances that followed her, not just because of her role, but because something felt off. Lucas, a junior flight attendant barely a year into the job, stood near the galley, double-checking the manifest. A name caught his eye. Amara Harris, seat 2A. Spouse of Malik Harris, Diamond VVIP, full discretion. He paused, lips slightly parted. Lucas had read about Malik Harris. He had watched him speak at a tech summit. The man was a billionaire. Yes, but more than that, he was a philanthropist, a reformer, a walking headline whenever he chose to be. Lucas swallowed hard, suddenly aware that something beyond his pay grade had just begun to unfold. He glanced over at Denise, who was straightening a tray on a nearby cart. Unaware, no one said anything to her. No one had to. Back in 2A, Amara took a slow sip of her now cool tea. She hadn't moved, hadn't shifted her weight, hadn't opened her book, hadn't spoken, but there was something different about her silence now. Not the kind born of weariness. The kind that waited for the world to catch up. Behind her, Malik closed his tablet and set it face down beside him. For now, he would let the machine do what it was built to do. But when it was time to speak, he would choose his words carefully. And very, very publicly. 30 minutes into the flight, the quiet choreography of first class resumed. Newspapers rustled in syncopated rhythm. Silverware clinked gently against porcelain. And the soft drone of polite conversation filled the cabin like background music in a hotel lounge. From the outside, everything had returned to normal. But Denise Carson moved differently now. She rolled her cart with steady hands. But her shoulders had stiffened. She had served this cabin hundreds of times before. Memorized the quirks of wealthy travelers, who preferred wine chilled, who disliked ice, who needed lemon wedges instead of lime. Her skill had always been invisibility, blending efficiency with charm. But now, something felt off. She could feel it, not in the air, but in the silence. When she reached 2A, her breath caught, not visibly, but just enough for her chest to tighten. She set the tray down carefully. One plate, two small bowls, a linen napkin folded precisely. "Your meal, ma'am," she said, her voice stripped of all pretense. Amara looked up. Her smile was not wide. It was calm, sincere, the kind of thank you that required effort. Not because of pride, but because of grace. "Thank you," she said, as if nothing had happened at all. That's what unnerved Denise the most. It wasn't the words. It was the composure, the refusal to react, to retaliate. Denise didn't know how to respond to that kind of restraint. Lucas, standing just behind the service galley partition, watched quietly. He was young but perceptive. He'd seen passengers yell over peanuts, cry over seat assignments. But this woman, Amara, had been shoved, dismissed, and wrongly accused of being in the wrong place. And yet she sat there, eating a plate of airline food like it was a quiet picnic in her own garden. Lucas had checked the manifest twice since learning her name. Amara Harris, not just a passenger, not just someone's wife. She was someone who held weight, not only in name, but in how she moved through the world. He didn't know everything about her, but he knew enough to stay alert. At that moment, Lucas's phone vibrated in his pocket. A discreet message from the airline's internal chat system for staff communications. Alert. Social media flag, Flight 7A, potential discrimination report circulating. Please verify incident. He swallowed hard. Charles Myers's tweet had not gone unnoticed. A diversity blogger had retweeted it with a caption, "Still happening in 2025? Then a freelance journalist based in Atlanta quoted it, asking for sources. By the time a travel influencer with 500,000 followers picked it up, the tone had shifted. It was no longer just a complaint. It was a story. Denise didn't know any of this yet, but she could feel something in the air, like the brief moment before turbulence hits. She was about to continue down the aisle when the intercom clicked softly, just loud enough to catch her attention. "Denise," came the captain's voice, clipped and formal, "when you have a moment, report to the secondary crew station. There's something we need to review." Denise froze, fingers still on the edge of the cart. She forced herself to sound casual. "Regarding what?" There was a pause. "I think you know." A few heads turned, just slightly, subtle, but no longer incidental. Her eyes scanned the cabin. The woman in 4B was watching her. So was the businessman in 1D. Even Lucas, that quiet boy with the clipboard, looked away too quickly when their eyes met. Denise pressed her lips together. Her steps as she moved the cart forward were still smooth, but something in her movements had lost its fluidity. She walked the length of the aisle without looking back, but the back of her neck felt hot, as if all the eyes she had avoided were still tracing the shape of her mistake. She didn't look at Amara again. She didn't need to, because for the first time in years, Denise Carson realized she wasn't invisible either. And in that realization, her breath felt heavier than the cabin air would allow. The crew galley at the back of first class was never meant for confrontation. It was where coffee was poured, where schedules were reviewed in hushed tones, where flight attendants traded glances and checked lipstick in the reflection of overhead bins. But today, it felt more like a small courtroom. Denise stepped inside, her shoes landing a little too sharply against the linoleum floor. The door closed behind her with a subtle click. In front of her stood Madeline, the senior flight supervisor on board, and Captain Doyle, tall, quiet, and not in the habit of calling in crew members mid-flight unless something had gone terribly wrong. On the folding counter, Madeline laid out a single sheet of paper. Denise's name was not on it, but the one name that was there, bolded, underlined, circled in red, made the blood drain from her face. Amara Harris, Seat 2A, spouse of Malik Harris, Tier Diamond VVIP, classified confidential. Denise stood frozen. For a moment, the familiar hum of the plane seemed distant, like hearing a conversation underwater. Her throat tightened. I didn't know. She stammered, her voice oddly high. I didn't read her name. I just followed the seating protocol. Madeline didn't respond right away. She folded her arms, the paper still resting between them like a quiet accusation. The issue, she said finally, her voice level, isn't whether you knew who she was. The issue is why you assumed she didn't belong. Denise opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her mind scrambled to justify herself. Procedure. Boarding zones. Uniform checks. But none of it mattered now. Not when that name was on the list. Not when the entire incident was now circling the internet like wildfire. Captain Doyle remained quiet. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to document. Denise, he said, you'll stay off the service line for the remainder of the flight. Lucas will take over the 2A to 3C section. We've sent a preliminary report to ground operations. You'll be contacted upon arrival. Denise nodded once. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been dismissed from duty mid-flight. It was a subtle removal, done without spectacle, but it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under her. She turned to leave, her steps slower than before, her breath tight in her chest. Outside, the mood in the cabin had shifted again. Amara sat quietly, her meal barely touched. She wasn't reading, wasn't writing, just resting her hands atop the folded napkin. A moment later, Lucas approached and handed her a small folded slip of paper. No eye contact, no words. Amara opened it. Thank you for your grace. We're taking care of it. She folded it once and slipped it into her journal without a word. A few rows behind, Malik's phone lit up. Notifications streamed in. Hashtags. Mentions. Media requests. He scrolled with deliberate slowness, reading each comment. One post in particular had gained traction. Hashtag seat for Amara. She didn't raise her voice, but the whole world heard her silence. He answered a call from his assistant. His voice was calm, almost detached. Hold all press inquiries for 6 hours. He said, I'm handling this from the plane. Then he ended the call, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. The cabin remained mostly quiet, but the undercurrent was different now. Charles Myers, the retired attorney who had watched it all unfold, stood and stepped into the aisle. His movement was tentative, but purposeful. He approached Amara slowly, his hand resting on the seat ahead of hers. Ma'am, he said, his voice low and sincere. I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry I didn't. Amara looked up at him. Her face didn't carry blame, only tired understanding. Thank you, she said softly. We all learn when we're ready. Charles nodded and returned to his seat, folding his hands in his lap as if holding something fragile. Then Denise stepped back into the cabin. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her posture had changed, still upright, but missing the edge, like a pillar with a crack running down the middle. She walked past Amara's row without looking, her pace slower, her presence quieter, and for the first time since the flight began, Denise Carson looked like someone unsure of where she belonged. The soft hum of the engines outside seemed to cradle the plane. But inside the cabin, the air hung thick and taut. Everything looked the same, silver cutlery resting against folded napkins, warm lights casting golden reflections across the windows, but there was no mistaking the tension. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It moved like a current beneath every conversation, every glance. Denise stood near the galley, her back straight but her presence ghost-like. No one had told her to stand there, but it had become clear, through looks and silence and the way her fellow attendants quietly filled in her usual tasks, that her role had shifted, or perhaps vanished. Around her, the service continued, but it moved differently now, more deliberate, more careful. A new awareness had settled over the cabin. Every passenger of color was addressed with heightened courtesy, as though the staff had suddenly remembered their training manuals. No one said so, of course, but it was in the posture, in the voice lowered just enough to signal respect, or guilt. Lucas approached Malik with the caution of someone entering a room they weren't sure they were allowed in. He held a small notepad, more as a gesture of formality than for function. Mr. Harris, he began quietly, we've received instruction from headquarters to extend a formal apology. If you'd like to address the cabin, I can make arrangements. Malik looked up from his lap. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. Instead of answering, he turned to Amara, seated just ahead of him. She had not moved since boarding. Her hands rested atop her journal. Her expression remained composed, almost still, but her stillness was not the stillness of passivity. It was the kind that held weight. Do you want to say something? Malik asked her gently. Amara didn't hesitate. She turned to him with the soft firmness of someone who had long decided who she was. No, she said, simply, we don't need to make noise. But they should understand what it feels like to be removed from the seat you paid for, just because they didn't think you belonged in it. Lucas stood quietly for a moment. Then, with a nod, he walked back toward the galley. Less than 5 minutes later, the cabin speakers clicked to life. The voice that followed was smooth, corporate, practiced, but there was a catch in its rhythm, like someone reading a script they knew would matter. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to extend a sincere apology to Mrs. Amara Harris and her family for an experience earlier in this flight that did not meet our standards. We are conducting a full review of the incident and remain committed to a service culture that honors every customer equally. Thank you for your attention. The message ended. The silence afterward was louder than anything that had come before it. Amara said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't shift in her seat. But something in the atmosphere around her had changed. It wasn't about validation. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about being seen. Fully, publicly. Back near the galley, Denise tightened her hands into fists at her sides. No one had looked at her during the announcement. That somehow made it worse. The absence of attention stung deeper than open accusation. She was still standing, still breathing, but she had never felt less present on a plane she had spent half her life flying. She remembered the first day she'd worn the uniform, how proud she had felt. How she'd called her mother from the tarmac and whispered, "I'm really doing it," and now, 20 years later, she couldn't bring herself to meet a single passenger's eye. In row 5, a young woman, Melissa, early 30s, traveling with a friend, leaned over and whispered just loud enough to be heard. She didn't even raise her voice. And yet the whole plane's listening to her. Malik heard it. He didn't look back. Instead, he reached forward and gently covered Amara's hand with his. Amara didn't move, but her fingers curled slowly, wrapping around his. Not tightly, just enough. She still hadn't spoken to the cabin. But somehow, everyone had heard her. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she wasn't invisible. The plane began its descent into San Francisco. But the atmosphere in first class didn't follow the usual rhythm of arrival. No one reached for their bags yet. No one rang for water or glanced out the window to catch a glimpse of the coastline. There was a kind of stillness that settled in the air, not awkward. Not tired, reflective. They had all seen it. And though no one would say it out loud, they knew they had been part of something larger than a mishap or a customer service blunder. They had witnessed a woman take back her space without a single raised voice. And the absence of noise made its presence impossible to ignore. Lucas, his notepad still tucked under his arm, moved down the aisle and paused beside seat 2D. Charles Myers looked up from his reading glasses. Sensing the approach, "Mr. Myers," Lucas whispered, "the media team wants confirmation. You were the first to report what happened, right?" Charles gave a faint smile. "Yes, I did, and I'll stand by every word." He paused, glancing toward Amara, then back at Lucas. "Tell them I didn't post it because she was married to a powerful man." He added, "I posted it because no one else was going to. And because respect should never be about who's on a list, it should be the baseline." Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "I'll make sure they know." At the Atlantic Skies regional headquarters in Los Angeles, the urgency was no longer behind closed doors. Evelyn Cho stood at the head of a conference table filled with muted screens. Each square represented a different department head: legal, PR, customer experience, flight operations. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This isn't about Mrs. Harris," Evelyn said. "This is about the gap between our policy and our practice. The next time this happens, and there will be a next time, we better not be playing catch-up." One executive cleared his throat. Hesitant. Do we release a statement today? Not yet, Evelyn said. We finish the internal report first. And we stop referring to this as an incident. This was a pattern. We were just lucky the person on the receiving end chose dignity over destruction. After the meeting, Evelyn typed a short message to Malik Harris on her private line. I didn't realize she was the one who experienced this. I didn't realize the strength she would show. And maybe that's the real problem. We never realize who people are until it's too late. Malik responded simply. That's why she's still the compass I follow. Back on board, the final descent began. Captain Doyle's voice came over the intercom with the usual landing instructions. But it had an added note of formality. Cabin crew, please secure the cabin for arrival. But one crew member wouldn't be part of the procedure. Denise had been instructed to remain seated for the remainder of the flight. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like something too tight, too visible. She sat in silence near the emergency exit row, watching the other attendants complete her tasks with quiet competence. Lucas, after closing the galley, stepped into the crew's back station and uploaded his final log from the flight. He double-checked every timestamp, every entry. It was done. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the internal investigation had already been logged, verified, and forwarded to senior command. As the passengers stood and reached for overhead compartments, there was a subtle choreography that unfolded. No rushing, no impatience, just a quiet order. Amara stood, collected her bag, and waited for the line to move forward. Denise, still seated, watched her approach. Amara didn't stop. She didn't pause to make a statement or to demand anything. She just met Denise's eyes, just once. And then she nodded, not in bitterness, not in triumph, but with the solemn gravity of someone who had nothing to prove. And everything already said. That nod was the last thing Denise saw before Amara turned and disappeared into the aisle. One by one, the other passengers followed. Lucas remained near the front, thanking each guest with a quiet sincerity. When Evelyn Cho stepped off the plane last, dressed in simple travel wear, without an identifying badge, no one gave her a second glance. But she didn't walk past Amara. She stopped, offered her hand. Mrs. Harris, she said softly, you didn't just hold this flight together. You held us accountable. Thank you. Amara shook her hand, surprised but composed. I didn't mean to cause all this. Evelyn's reply was instant. You didn't cause it. You revealed it. And then she was gone. The gate closed behind them. The crew began cleanup. The world outside resumed its ordinary pace. But somewhere in a locked server room at Atlantic Sky's headquarters, a line of code updated a pilot project into permanent policy. Respect first wasn't a slogan anymore. It had a face now. And it belonged to someone who had said so little, yet spoken so much. 3 weeks had passed. The headlines had moved on. The trending hashtags faded into digital archives. But in a quiet corner of a small cafe in Berkeley, something still stirred. Amara sat near the window, the light catching in the silver of her hair. Her book open but unread. The cafe was modest, brick walls, handwritten chalkboard menus, the kind of place where conversations lingered longer than coffee. Her tea, still steaming, sat untouched on the table beside her well-worn leather journal. The bookmark hadn't moved. She flipped it open and ran a fingertip along the same line she had written months ago. One day, build a travel foundation for young black women to see the world safely. It had been an idea, a quiet thought on a quiet morning. But now, the words carried a weight she could no longer ignore. She heard the bell above the door chime, a soft tinkle like wind through glass. A young woman stepped in, hesitant at first. She was tall, with braids pulled back neatly and a law school sweatshirt hanging loose over jeans. She looked around as if searching for something, or someone. Their eyes met. The girl took a breath and walked over. Voice low but clear. Excuse me, are you Mrs. Amara Harris? Amara smiled gently. Yes, I am. I'm sorry to interrupt. My name's Jade. I'm a law student at UC Berkeley. I saw the video. I followed everything. I wanted to thank you. Amara gestured to the seat across from her. Please, sit. Jade sat, folding her hands in her lap, her fingers nervously tapping one another. I've had my own moments. she said softly, being told I didn't belong. In classrooms, in conferences, even at interviews, I never fought back. I was always afraid it would just make things worse. Amara listened without interrupting, her eyes calm and steady. But then I saw you. Jade continued. You didn't shout, you didn't push back, but everyone heard you, and it made me realize, maybe we don't have to speak loudly to speak clearly. Amara nodded, her smile touched with something deeper, recognition. Sometimes, she said, silence is the loudest truth we have, but only if we know why we're keeping it. Jade let the words settle. The cafe noise faded behind them, the hiss of espresso, the soft clatter of mugs, as the two women talked, not as strangers, not as hero and admirer, but as two people who had walked different parts of the same road. Across town, a press conference was concluding. Atlantic Skies had just made public its newest passenger protection policy, the Thompson Clause. Named in honor of Marion Thompson, a black woman who had once been removed from a flight in 1978 for looking out of place. The clause aimed to ensure respect at every stage of air travel, from booking to boarding, from seating to service. Behind the podium, the airline's spokesperson read the statement clearly. This isn't just about policy. It's about dignity. We're not correcting a moment. We're rebuilding a culture. No names were mentioned. No need. That same afternoon, on an inbound flight to Chicago, a flight attendant quietly walked through first class. Seat 2A sat unoccupied. Pristine. She paused, looked at the laminated name card in her hand, and gently placed it on the tray table. The card read, "This seat is always reserved for dignity." Back at the cafe, Amara closed her journal, slipping the bookmark back into place. She looked out the window, past the reflection of her own face, to the sidewalk beyond. People moved on, unaware of who she was, unaware of what she had carried. And that was fine, because Amara knew now, her story didn't need to be loud to last. It just needed to be remembered. She never raised her voice. But the cabin grew quieter with every moment she stayed still. No spotlight, no headline, just a seat reclaimed, and a silence that made people look inward. Sometimes dignity doesn't walk in with a badge or a name. It simply sits down where it belongs, and waits to be seen. And maybe that's all it ever needed. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, or even just a pause, subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that echo long after they end. Thank you for watching.